here to provide some insight about these horrible conditions Christians and other minority groups are facing in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, the president of the Arab American Institute, James Zogby. Jim, we welcome you back to America's Forum.
Thank you.
Jim, help us understand the bigger picture. How are Arab countries reacting to this persecution of Christians, principally now in Iraq and Syria?
Well, listen, I'd have to take some issue with the ambassador. The fact is that this problem, in particular in Iraq, began in the last decade. It was for better or for worse, understand that it was the overthrow of Saddam Hussein that unleashed this sectarian conflict. Christians felt protected in Iraq. It was a secular regime. It was a brutal regime. It was a grotesque regime in many ways, but it was secular and it protected the Christian minority. When you had an upsurge, an insurgent Shia majority, then taking vengeance on the Sunni minority that had ruled, in the midst of that civil war, Christians and other minorities were very vulnerable, and they bore the brunt of it. The Christian community in Iraq went from 1.4 million to 400,000 during the first decade of the Iraq War, and no one paid attention. The Bush administration did not raise a peep. No one even knew that there was a Christian community in Iraq when the war started. And when we warned, be careful what happens to Christians if you make this war, if you don't pay attention to them in the context of making that war, people turned a deaf ear and ignored it. Same thing in Syria. For better, for worse, people in Syria, the Christian community in Syria says, you know, Bashar al-Assad has protected us. We've been safe in Iraq, in Syria. And look, the regime, I believe, is a brutal regime. It's a horrible government. I do believe that the Geneva II process, a settlement that sort of paves the way for a new, more representative government, is critical. But Christians there are feeling like vulnerable because they're afraid of when the Ba'ath Party goes, they're going to be at risk. They're already at risk. So it's a different situation from country to country. And I think that we need to pay attention, but we need to also pay attention to the conditions that exist so that we know how to solve it and don't make more mistakes in the context of trying to solve it.
Jim, I'm joined here on the anchor desk by Miranda Khan, who has a question for you.
Jim,
sure.
You said it varies from country to country. Let's go back to Iraq. Now that there's been a change in command there, do you think the situation is going to change?
No time soon, to be sure, but there's no question that without a new government that was more representative, more inclusive, that would give the Sunni community an opportunity to feel that Baghdad would represent them, there was no long-term solution to Iraq. The question of what happens to minorities, however, is related somewhat because it's the extremists among the Sunni community who have been tormenting them now, although extremists in the Shia community were tormenting them earlier. The point right now is that we need a two-track policy, one that looks at the minorities and what do we do to protect them, and secondly, what do we do to create a long-term solution that creates a more representative, inclusive government in Iraq so that maybe a decade from now we won't be in this situation anymore. I've been working with the Christian Iraqi community, and they've got a three-pronged approach. One is humanitarian assistance is desperately needed. The second is to create the conditions for a protected zone in the Nineveh Plain area, which the Peshmerga have entered, the Kurdish forces have entered, but a UN resolution that would get the Peshmerga to pull back and create a UN protected safe area for Christians and other minorities would, I think, be in order. That's something the U.S. could get behind and support. And the third would be for those who are out, for those who fear going back, expanding our immigration quotas because we have a very vibrant Iraqi Christian community here in the country. They're willing to care for their own. It's not a cost to our government. They need a safe place to come.
Jim, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to take a moment now and talk about the negative stereotypes created by ISIS for other Arab countries.
You know, it's they're the worst nightmare of everybody, including the Muslim community, because frankly speaking, you know, ISIS has killed more Muslims than they've killed anybody. They've killed more Sunni Muslims than they've killed anybody because it's a vicious, militant gang of murderers who rule by fear and terror. And so, yeah, it's been a horrific problem. What I truly hope occurs is that in addition to whatever coalition the president is assembling, that Arab states front and center are a part of that coalition because they've got a lot at stake here. This gang has to be rolled back. They have to be defeated, but they can only be defeated in the context of a comprehensive international approach and a reformed government in Iraq. There's both a military component, but also a political reform component. But Arab governments have to be a part of it. I hope that they will be.
Jim, only about a minute remains. You're on the advisory board of this group in defense of Christians, which is holding a 3-day conference that I believe starts today. Very quickly, what can you tell us about this conference, and what do you hope will come out of that conference?
Greater awareness about the Christian situation, but not greater awareness that becomes devolves into Islam and Muslim bashing. You can get some applause here in Washington by negative stereotypes against Muslims and beating up on them, but that's not going to win you anything in the Middle East. There needs to be an understanding of the context of the Middle East, of what needs to be done, and then we have to have a resolve to go and do it. Right. Thank you.
Jim, we appreciate your insights on this, and we'll leave it right there. Thanks very much for your time. Tell you what, we're interested in your comments on what Jim Zogby had to say. Why don't you tweet us your remarks at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum.